much money that's going to give us
I thought about it.
Good afternoon, this is Occupy Keeling coming to you live from the Iowa Utilities Board headquarters. This is day 4 for the back of the pipeline deliberation. Yesterday at slow before 3 o'clock, around 3 o'clock, they went into closed session to discuss matters that could be or are in current litigation regarding the back of the pipeline. And those matters they cannot discuss in public. So they said they would return to open session today, and they cited all 3 of the rules that would cause the board to want to go into a closed session. And they invoked all 3 of those rules. So they will discuss some things that resulted from their closed deliberation yesterday that they can discuss in public, and it is possible that they could render their ruling today, whether or not to grant Dakota Access and Energy Transfer Partners a permit to build a backup pipeline that would bisect Iowa from northwest to southeast. So in a few minutes, the session will begin.
I don't even know about
that was considered advertising,
It's rigged.
Yeah, the system is rigged.
And it's owned. And because other parties are blocked from participating, and even those within the party, there's a guy named Willie Wilson who ran as a Democrat, but he was blocked from participating in the debates. But he got himself on the ballot in some of the primary states.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe satellite radio.
But if there was room after the people who are parties come in and there's still open seats, then they said you can move up. There's speakers all over the room.
If any of these people here are specifically landowners, is she a landowner?
Yeah. I think most of the people in here will be landowners.
The company was selling off all the old stuff. They had so many tractors, like model tractors. Basically, like,
Yeah.
You put a laptop in there that could put some weight in it.
Yep. That's for fixing this laptop.
Yeah, that's very cool. Oh. First one, and almost put those on in there. And then.
The Iowa Utilities Board is now in session on docket number HLP 2014001. The date is February 11th, 2016. It's 1 o'clock p.m. As many of you know, the Iowa Utilities Board went into closed session yesterday. That was recorded as required by law, and we did adjourn at sometime after 5 o'clock. And now we are coming back into open session, and while we were in closed session yesterday, we discussed asking General Counsel to prepare a draft order for consideration that included both sides or discussions and putting those into a document for the board to review in a future meeting. Do I have a motion to direct General Counsel to prepare that draft order for our consideration?
So moved.
It's been moved and seconded to direct General Counsel to prepare a draft order under those conditions. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Hearing none, motion carries. So today, the plan is to discuss some of the factors that will affect our decision about whether the proposed pipeline will meet the statutory standard that it must promote the public convenience and necessity. We will be meeting again next Friday, February 19th, starting at 1 o'clock p.m. to discuss the terms and conditions that have been proposed by the parties, both at the hearing and in their briefs and reply briefs. In addition, for the information of the public, we have reserved March 9th and 10th for future deliberations. That date has been pegged based on our belief that we'll be able to direct General Counsel next Friday to proceed with some additional comments related to eminent domain and other constitutional issues we believe have been raised in this case. With those dates in mind, we are going to turn our discussion to the factors related to public convenience and necessity, and I am going to, for the benefit of the audience, we are following Exhibit F of the petition presented and filed on January 20th, 2015 by Dakota Access LLC. Within that position, there were approximately 8, depending on how you divide them out, 8 proposals describing how Dakota Access believed the proposed pipeline will promote the public convenience and necessity. They are then required to present evidence at the hearing justifying that those reasons have been met and providing testimony to the same. We are starting with the first issue, which was identification of the purpose of the pipeline, and that is to move an economical, abundant, reliable, and domestic supply of crude oil from Bakken and Three Forks production region in North Dakota to a crude oil market hub located near Patoka, Illinois. At this time, I will entertain comments from the board. Ms. Jacobs?
Thank you. In regarding to the stated purpose as filed in the petition by Dakota Access, I would agree that it's been proven that the pipeline is to serve as a transportation operation to move crude oil from the Bakken and Three Forks production regions in North Dakota to a crude oil market hub located near Patoka, Illinois. There would be no refining of the product anywhere between North Dakota until it reaches Patoka, and strictly it would be used to transport that oil from those oil fields through the states of North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, and Illinois. I think that has been duly pointed over time and time again by all the parties involved, that that is the main purpose of the pipeline, and I think the evidence in the case certainly shows that that is its role.
Mr. Wagner?
I would agree. I think that was pretty straightforward, and nobody really contested that it wasn't going to move crude oil. So I think that's definitely the purpose, and will serve as what we intended in that manner.
And I don't disagree on paragraph 1 of the petition document. I would like to know if there's any conversation by the other board members on whether or not there should be consideration on out-of-state benefits when applying our promote the public convenience and necessity standard. I'm going to rely on both of you just to kind of step in. I'm not going to.
So there's arguments on both. As staff has told us, and then in a testimony and pre-filed, or the briefs, I think there's two sides. One is that because I think it was the electrical transmission code contains language specifically alluding to whether or not the board can or can't, I don't remember which one it is, consider benefits outside the state, but yet this one does not. Some argue that means that the legislature intended for it to also apply, so it must mean that it says that you can't include outside benefits. Do I have that backwards?
I think the argument is that because Chapter 478 relating to electric transmission line franchises contains a provision that expressly allows the board to consider outside, that the absence of that provision in 479B, it is argued, implies that the board cannot consider outside benefits.
And you know, having spent some time under the Golden Dome, it's difficult to determine legislative intent when you're there, let alone when you're not there. So I think we have to take a pretty strict look at that, and that it's the fact that it does not specify in 479B whether we can or can't look at external to the state of Iowa benefits. I think that allows us the opportunity to look at all benefits across not only the state of Iowa, but also benefits outside the state. And I think it's difficult to break them apart, because if there are benefits to the entire nation, or to other states, or to other areas, ultimately that is going to benefit Iowans because we're a part of that whole package. Then the question, I think, becomes, what is the weighting of that benefit, or how much of that benefit does come back to Iowans? And then part of that is, how much do you look at the benefits outside as weighing on our decision, and benefits outside of Iowa? So I think, long way of saying it, I think there are benefits, or we can consider, and I think we should consider benefits both in Iowa and outside Iowa. And the same would be true of if there's any detriments, or what those detriments or costs might be.
I would also look at the differences in the statutes. The language regarding transmission is certainly much more, gives a little bit more direction. However, as I look at chapter 479B regarding pipelines, when it defines the word pipeline, it uses the word interstate in there as well as intrastate. And obviously, one would think there's a difference between interstate and intrastate, but the statute specifically saying interstate, it to me contemplates the issuance of permits for pipelines that don't have an endpoint in Iowa. It goes beyond the state's boundaries, which to me gives me the sense that the legislative action indicated that we could take into consideration benefits that are outside the state if it was something along an interstate pipeline. Obviously, we certainly are interested in the benefits for Iowans, but because of the nature of many of the systems we have, whether it's transmission, whether it's interstate highways, interstate pipeline, in my mind, the statute gives us guidance there that we can look at benefits that are outside the state of Iowa. I think at the same time, as Board Member Wagner mentioned, we also can look at the detriments and the negatives that are outside the state of Iowa as well. So I think we can balance both benefits, but the opposite of that as well. But my read of the statute, with the word interstate, is being the focus, that it gives us the opportunity to look and consider benefits that are not just strictly for the state of Iowa.
Have either of you looked at OCA and in their testimony, in their original brief, they talk about applying a standard that was used with our predecessor in 79 in the Northern Pipeline case. And the Commerce Commission at that time justified its determination reasonably necessary to serve a public use. Was number 2 was Iowa's reliance on out-of-state refineries, including the Minnesota refineries, to be served by the proposed pipeline for refined petroleum products. I think also are assistive in making that determination.
And I don't want to make a legal argument from one side or the other, but also as I look at the question between which statute applies and what did it really mean, if I remember correctly, the transmission line statute has changed after the last change, the pipeline statute, which would, I think, if the intent was to apply it to both, that would have happened at that time, and clearly it didn't happen.
I would like to think that was the case, but like several of us up here, having served under the Golden Dome, not always quite sure that one is referenced back to the statute, but because one seems to be silent on that issue even after the change, that would lead me to believe that would be a reasonable expectation.
But Mr. Wagner, you're correct in that the other side of the coin is if it doesn't provide any direct service in the state of Iowa, it doesn't meet those standards, and I understand that argument. And I think it's been made by several of the parties and clearly should be set out as the alternative. Are you ready to move to number 2, or do you want further discussion on this topic? Number 2 in Exhibit F's petition includes the project will improve overall safety to the public and environment. It will reduce crude oil shipped by truck and by rail and increase the amount shipped by pipeline. I would start out by saying, well, it's obvious that it will increase the amount shipped by pipeline. The question is whether or not there's improved safety, whether it's shipped by truck or by rail, and what weight is to be given to that analysis.
I'll go ahead and start on that one. There were obviously a variety of opinions on this topic that were presented to us. throughout the, in the pre-trial testimony as well as in the cross-examinations that occurred and in post-hearing briefs as well. And I do think the issue of overall safety to the public and environment is certainly one of the more critical issues that we must consider. Yes, it will definitely decrease the amount of crude oil that is shipped by truck and by rail. There are several parties who indicated safety records were better for pipelines versus for rail and truck lines. Others indicated just the opposite of that. So it's taking a look at the variety of factors that were presented by all the parties and trying to weigh which one would make the most, which offers the most knowledge and expertise on this issue. It certainly will increase the amount shipped by the pipeline, and there are safety indications that show that pipelines have, in some cases, a better overall safety record. So it's just by sheer volume of number versus what is shipped by rail and by truck. But I also know that when you look at the records for the trucking and railroads, there have been some fairly significant incidents that have occurred. That has been pointed out in the evidence presented before us. And so one must weigh the significance of those versus the significance of a leakage of the pipeline. So safety versus, in terms of public immediate safety from explosions, fires, those kinds of things, versus safety in terms of the environment, impact to water, soil, and other areas of the environmental side. I think those are different areas that we have to look at in terms of safety. Overall, I do think there could be a leaning towards improvement in overall safety by using a pipeline versus taking off a rail or truck, but the numbers show that there certainly are safety concerns on either sort of delivery that was used.
I would agree with a lot of what Board Member Jacobs said. I would add that with the rail, we've seen the incidents that have happened in populated areas, because that's typically where railroads run because of the history of railroads linking cities and towns and populated areas. So when you look at it from that perspective, you know, will it reduce the amount of oil shipped by truck or rail? That's dependent on production, and that's dependent on demand. I don't know that building the pipeline clearly will ship more oil through pipelines, but it doesn't change the demand for oil, and then that demand is what ultimately drives production to determine whether or not there's going to be more or fewer rail cars shipping oil. So I would happen to agree, and I think because the pipeline is not going through major populated areas and does avoid those, from that perspective, I think it is somewhat safer than shipping by rail or truck.
I come at it from a slightly different view. I don't see that whether it's rail, pipeline, or truck, that there's any inherent increases in safety. I think they all have risks, and I think the real issue is whether there's any kind of leakage or spill from any of those entities. I think some of the evidence that's been presented clearly shows that statistically, at least the evidence that I recollect off the top of my head and am reading in a couple of the briefs, shows that there are more accidents by larger accidents by pipeline than they are by rail transportation or truck transportation. Even Mr. Dakota Access's witness, Mr. Lipson, documented some of that information when he was showing the differences between pipeline, truck, and rail. Having said that, I think that comes and is weighed against the safety factors that are put in place as to whether or not we determine that the public purpose standard has been met. So that's, I mean, I just don't give that as much weight because I think they all have inherent risks.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. And I think when you look at number of incidents, I think you have to really look at number of incidents versus amount, put it on a percentage basis. It's sort of like if I drive 2,000 miles a year and have one speeding ticket versus someone who drives 200,000 miles a year and has one speeding ticket. If you're looking at per incidence, who's a worse driver? It's, we're the same, but when you look at it on a comparative basis, clearly the person that drove more miles from a percentage standpoint has fewer incidents. So, but I agree, they all have inherent risks, and I think when you look at what is planned for construction, those risks have been taken into account in making the wall thickness thicker in certain areas, ensuring that they've got valves in critical areas. And while you can't mitigate every risk that's out there, I think you can take actions to make sure that you're minimizing that risk and minimizing the result of any incidents that might occur.
And I concur that any form of transportation of the crude oil has its risks. I think we also have to look at what kind of emergency management programs are in place, whether it's for the rail, the truck, or the pipeline. What's the work with the folks who are the emergency management individuals on the ground in our state? What training is available? What kind of regular review and inspection and general maintenance is done of the pipeline? I think that all comes into play as we consider the overall safety to the public and to the environment in this issue. And I think something we definitely need to consider are the plans that Dakota Access has laid out in terms of first responders and emergency management training. I think it's something that needs to be considered for a variety of entities, whether it's not only the pipeline but also rails and trucking. That seems to be one of the most common things we hear over and over, is that the folks haven't always had the kind of training they need, and that is certainly something we need to make sure is done and is offered to individuals on the ground as well.
Which is a perfect segue into the disclaimer on the fact that obviously the board members have made comments about emergency management and about the training that our emergency responders would receive. And I know for one, I've blocked it all, but after the hearing, I was receiving every single notice of every training that was available for pipelines for emergency management from the local Altoona Fire Department. So they wanted to ensure that I knew that there was actually training being offered, because apparently I asked that question. So there's my disclaimer for the record, Mr. Wright and Mr. Lynch. Do you have any further comments?
Yeah, I do. I was just going back and checking my notes. Was Mr. Nickel an OCA witness? I think it was, because I jotted down. Yeah, I think in his testimony, he concluded that the pipeline would not, this is his quote, pipeline will not pose an undue threat of serious injury to the environment, will not substantially impact the health, safety, or welfare of the citizens of Iowa. And don't ask me to cite a page, because I forgot to take that in my notes. I just know at some point I jotted that down.
because that paragraph, included overall safety and public and the environment, and we're just basically, and we're talking about whether it's pipeline, truck, or transportation, I just am going to be stating, we're coming back to safety of the public and environment under safety, and.
I was just, yeah, cause I just looked at the safety point, it's
Right.
saying that yeah, improve overall safety of the public.
Does anybody remember, was it Becky Wehrman Anderson that talked about some of those statistics on rail versus, whose witness was that? Was she? You remember?
I think it may have been the science environment, SEH, I think.
Mr. Sanderins?
It was not.
Yeah, I just am trying to find out, I can't remember whose witness it was, she was.
According to, my records, she was a witness on behalf of the Iowa Farmland Owners Association, and that would fall under Mr. Craig.
They're trying to find a specific piece of testimony.
Okay, I'm going to move to number 3 from Exhibit F. The project will play a role in increasing America's energy independence. Dakota Access is a means to transfer domestically produced crude oil to support United States consumers' energy demand. And for our purposes, in the pre-filed testimony, Dakota Access shifted that from energy independence to energy security, and Caruso reply testimony at page 2. So that one would change from the original petition to the new language of energy security.
You guys waiting for me to start? Yeah, and I think I remember that during the hearing even, there was discussion about whether it's energy independence or energy security. I think it's pretty difficult for the U.S. to become energy independent. We're always going to be dependent. And even today in the electrical grid, the Northeast is importing significant amounts of energy from Canadian hydro resources. And there's no reason that's not going to continue. So I think, yeah, looking at energy independence versus energy security, anything that we can produce domestically, I think, is better than, particularly oil, depending on where it's coming from, although our largest country that we receive the most oil from is actually Canada, which most people don't realize. And I mentioned demand before. I think whatever we produce in the U.S., whatever we need is based on demand. So as far as increasing energy independence or security, I guess you want to say, I think if the demand is there, that oil is going to be produced one way or the other. It doesn't matter whether we ship it by oil train or pipe or truck, pipe, or rail. If the demand is asking for that oil to be produced, it's going to be produced. So I don't know that it weighs a whole lot for me that it's energy security, energy independence. I think that's important, but I don't know that this pipeline changes it one way or another.
Don't you think, though, that it comes into play when you're looking at whether you believe in reducing our reliance upon oil in any way? There are two theories on it. One is, until people decide they don't want to do it, the other side is you take it away. You don't produce as much, and it will reduce the amount, or you require some of the environmental changes that we have. Maybe those are the two views. Which
right.
comes first?
Yeah, and I agree. And I don't think the decision before us is to change how much we're using. This decision is, do we allow for a pipeline to be built to ship it? And so if the demand, you have to change the demand for oil. And I agree, you can do that. I mean, you really have to make that choice to say, we don't want to use more oil. But until that decision is made, the demand for oil will drive production. So then the question becomes, what's the best way, or one of the questions in front of us, is it safer, is it a better way to ship that oil through a pipeline than by some other means? And again, I don't think when you go to the gas pump, you're not pumping gas wondering if that gas came by truck, rail, or pipeline. Most likely came by all three. But that's not the decision that's going through your mind. The decision that's going through your mind is, should I be using more gas, or should I be using an alternative fuel or something else?
I mean, right after I look to see if it's ethanol or not, and then, but the point is that I'm not thinking about that. But if you reduce it or you increase the pipe, that's the price, that's the argument that individuals have. So by providing another means of transportation, are you yet again, assisting those of us that don't think about it when we fill up our gas tank, or buy our newest, largest vehicle? I understand your argument, but the other side is.
Yeah. So your contending, or what you're saying is that because the pipeline provides for a alternative to transport it, if there was a constraint on that transport, it wouldn't be consumed?
I think that the consumption declines when there are barriers put into place.
Well, certainly.
And,
But the price also increases.
but I do think that's, again, something that has to be weighed when you're looking at whether you meet all of the elements we have for PCN.
Yeah, and I agree with you there, and like I said, for me, I think the consumption is gonna drive, the demand drives production more than the transport. So I think that a transport is a small portion of that, and so in weighing whether or not that has an impact, it's rather small compared to other factors in this case, for me.
I'll take us back a little bit to the independence and security. I'll get to where you are, but since the initial question was about energy independence, and yes, Mr. Caruso in his reply testimony, at least in some of his reply testimony indicated a shift. Instead of saying energy independence, it was more of energy security. And I don't quite know what all is entailed with energy security. There could be lots of different, I shouldn't say I don't know. In my understanding, there's lots of different ways one could look at that. I think in this case, I look more at, is it a diversification of energy sources instead of maybe energy security? Is it one more thing that Americans, Iowans can utilize in their mixture of energy? So to me, maybe energy security more comes down to diversification, access to something that was produced within the United States instead of relying on other countries, other areas for that. So to me, that's my spin more on security, is more diversity. Then I think back to the question of demand and the conversation the two of you just had about if there's less available, will that, would that impact behavior? Would that impact less reliance on a fuel of this kind? Also the whole issue of if the production is there and it's going to continue and demand is there, is that something that needs to be considered under security as well? And I think it's really a balance at this point. Overall, I don't feel, I'm looking at independence security, that's probably not going to be the highly weighted element in my decision on public use and getting to a public convenience and necessity. But I think we do have to look at demand, diversity, in terms of what would consumers use otherwise, what would consumers want, would it change their behavior if the product wasn't there? I think those are all very important variables that we can consider in looking at the public use.
Neither of you talked to me about the energy security and the legislation that passed after federally on opening up our borders. And I know we haven't talked about it. I'm interested in your thoughts on.
Are you talking about the export of oil?
Yeah.
Well, and I think on the first day I said that it kind of it's the same thing to me. Well, actually, there's testimony from the hearing that was actually posed. What if the export ban didn't exist, and the testimony was this would still go to Midwest refineries because that's where the demand for that type of oil is. And if I remember correctly, I think even those refineries are set up to handle this type of oil. Other refineries in the world are not. I think that was. I have to go back and double check. But so again, for me, it's a matter of how much weight do you give that. We're not determining how this is used.
How does that apply at all, though?
That's arguably what I'm saying is I don't know that it applies much at all, and it just doesn't weigh on my decision whether you can or can't export oil because we're not determining. I suppose maybe if you got to the argument that because this was going to Midwest refineries or has the opportunity to go to Midwest refineries, then you see some reduction in price, or because it's meeting the demand that's in the Midwest for and in Iowa for oil and gas and all the products that we use to do what we do every day. But I think again, that's gonna be a pretty small difference. So whether or not it goes somewhere else or stays here, I don't think this pipeline is gonna change what happens to that oil. Again, demand is driving the production. The production is gonna happen if the demand is there. And if there's a squeeze on getting the refined products that are needed, we've either gotta import them, which is much more costly and uses more energy arguably than if it's available domestically. So, again, doesn't matter where, the demand is gonna drive where the product goes. So for me, whether or not the pipeline is there or not, it might make it easier to get where the demand is, but the product's gonna go where the demand is asking it to go, if you will.
I would concur. I think demand is the driver in this. That certainly was what the testimony that was presented to us by Dakota Access indicated, that the plan was for that to be refined in the Midwest and stay and meet the Midwestern and the U.S. needs. That was obviously before the ban was lifted on the export of crude oil, but even still, we were given assurances that the demand was high enough within certainly the Midwestern region, if not all of the United States, that the focus wasn't waiting to have that ban lifted in order to make this project work. Because once again, it goes back to who needs it, where, and what's the most economical way for that to be transported, and that was the case that Dakota Access was making in terms of where they would ship it to and why the demand was there.
Well, I think when you look at the fact that I gotta be careful I don't get into confidential. I won't use numbers. That they have contracts for a project that's not completed, doesn't have the regulatory approvals, and before that ban was there, is an indication that there is that demand from the market before the ban was lifted. So I think I said when the ban was, but anyway. So that sort of does, I think, lend some, again, to Mr. Mahmood's testimony that the demand isn't to ship this oil, the demand is to refine it here in the U.S. and the Midwest plant. And then we got into the discussion, there was discussion of the PAD 2 and PAD 3 areas, and I have to go back and look at my notes in the testimony, look at which one is which, but again, the testimony showed that's where the demand is for this type of oil.
Excuse me. I have asked the other board members if they could point me to the OCA language that related to energy security.
changes that relate to energy, the change in language from energy independence to energy security. So this may take a couple of minutes.
Exhibit F number 4. The project will create another reliable transportation route for crude oil from Bakken.
I'll take that one, I don't, we were all learning back and forth, I just read it, so. It certainly will create another transportation route for crude oil from the Bakken. I don't think there's any question over the case that was presented in Dakota Access. I think maybe the focus there is on the word reliable, making sure does reliable include safe and cost effective and all of those kinds of issues that might surround it. But in terms of another transportation route for crude oil, it is that oil is going to continue to come out of the ground. Production is there, the demand is there. It would offer another form of transportation for the crude oil, in addition to rail and trucks and other pipelines that are out there. I think for us the bigger issue is that we focus on the word reliable as one that meets other parameters in terms of public use. And that to me goes back, as I said, to safety, environmental, cost effective, might say most expedient, and I think there are a variety of words that would have to back up the word reliable. But in terms of a transportation route, I think that's pretty well documented.
Yeah, the only thing I have to add is that, yeah, we determine what reliable means, and I think in a sense we will as we start talking about the specific issues that were raised and how they apply to the overall case.
I think the difficulty I have with this one and a couple of the others is I don't like how you have to apply the law to the questions. And so when you apply it, the law, and whether or not it'll create another reliable transportation route, well, as we all know, there are a lot of different ways of transporting goods. And if we're transporting and using a pipeline, then what's the goal for the future? Because you have hundreds of miles of pipeline in the ground currently, many of which are out of date, unused, unreliable, and how does that play into what the responsibilities of the utilities board is? So do I think that it will create another reliable transportation route? I think that it absolutely does that, but I'm not convinced that that plays into the weighting that I give to meeting public convenience and necessity. But because I think we have a lot of infrastructure that needs to be improved and changed, and so again, it's part of the learning curve for me. But what happens to the ones that are abandoned? I've been told that it's better to leave them in the ground. Well, if technology changes, what do we do in the future when there's no pristine ground left?
I think those are very viable questions, but we still have to go back to what the law says and what the petition says. But you're absolutely right. I mean, how many transportation routes do there need to be? I think that's, obviously a question as well. But certainly could come in the deliberation, but I think we have to go back to the basic tenet is it providing a reliable transportation route for oil. And just as a phrase, I think it's where we have to look at it and then decide the weighting on that. And if we factor in all the other transportation modes, and if you start talking about highways and railways and all the other pipelines, how far do we start to let that out to? I mean, we have 44,000 miles of pipeline in this state, so that is a question, absolutely.
Well, I'm ready to move to the next one. All right. Number 5 of Exhibit F, petition, the project will ease transportation constraints for agricultural products, freeing up rail capacity and reducing price pressure for shipping commodities.
I think there was much discussion about this in testimony and during the hearing. I believe it was Miss Cub, who's a Dakota witness, Dakota access witness, that testified to a report and some research that she had done. There was questions whether that actually included Iowa or not. And I don't, if you arguably you could say if there's one train it displaces, then you've freed up rail space. So I don't know how you say, yeah, it does a little bit, or no, it doesn't at all, or what level. And there's certain, the difficulty too is anytime you look at a single report, it's going to look at a single time frame or some short period, and that was the I guess I'll call it rebuttal testimony or rebuttal questioning was along the lines of, well, those conditions don't exist anymore for that rail congestion. So we can't really take that into account because, well, those congestion things don't exist today. But we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I think, again, if you displace one train, that does help with rail congestion. So there is some benefit. It's just a matter of, okay, how much is that benefit?
I would agree that I think the weighting of this benefit is probably a little lower, maybe than some of the other things that we have already discussed or will discuss based on Exhibit F. We certainly had some conflicting evidence and testimony on this issue. There were some statements that a significant amount of rail cars would be freed up. I think Dakota Access indicated it would take 642 rail cars each day to ship the 450,000 barrels a day of oil. There were others who indicated that it may not be quite that same number. The question would be, if that frees up a train or cars, will those go for ag shipments? Or will it just reduce the number of cars that are on a train, or just reduce one more train that's on the track and not make up for any of the ag shipments? I didn't see a lot of correlation between if we eliminate this car, that's going to free it up so that this car of grain can go forward. There's a lot of mathematical equations that were used and percentages, but I'm not sure in the scope of things this is something that deserves a heavy weighting, at least in my mind, on this. I think certainly if congestion does occur and you can reduce some of that congestion, that's a good thing for rail transportation, but whether it's going to impact ag shipments, I think it depends on what's being shipped that day or that week and who's utilizing the railroads and what else is out there. And so I think this is one that falls lower on the weighting scale for me.
So what I remember is when the railroads come in, they say that the constraints they have are shipping through the Chicago hub. And I just don't see how this addresses some of our agricultural issues that are going east because of that. And the testimony that we received, ironically, from, I think that it was in the public comments, from one of the individuals that actually works on the rail but was speaking for the pipeline, I found very interesting. Number 6 on Exhibit F is the project will have direct benefits to communities located along the route, including but not limited to temporary construction employment, full-time employment, local jobs to operate and maintain the pipeline, right-of-way payments, additional sales tax revenues, annual state and local community revenue from property taxes, and long-term support of regional contractors, manufacturers, distributors, and retailers. There were so many issues that were within that area that we had different testimony on. I'm not sure if you want to separate those out. I think property taxes is a separate issue with weight for it, along with a couple of the other ones that I think you have to weigh them in looking at our PCN requirements and public use requirements. I don't think right-of-way payments play into this determination, but I do think that it plays into public use.
I would concur. I think we do need to separate some of this out, based on how this was written in the exhibit that was filed. So I'll put property taxes aside. I too look at right-of-way payments as something that's probably more appropriate under the conversation of public use. You know, we did hear a lot, remember there was significant back and forth on what should be counted as an economic benefit and what shouldn't, put it in those layman's terms without going back to all the testimony on that. So probably separating that aside in public use. In terms of other direct benefits to the community, certainly there are, it's been documented, there are construction jobs. Those construction workers will need a place to be housed, they'll need to be fed. You know, obviously there's going to have to be services to support the many workers along the way. So yes, there certainly will be some sort of direct economic benefit to those communities located along the path, the proposed path of the pipeline. Obviously, longer term, once the construction was over, the number of employees that Dakota Access has indicated would be stationed in Iowa, I think is 12, with 10 in Cambridge. I think Cambridge, Iowa is the hub for those. So that's a different area, a smaller number, obviously, than the construction workers, but certainly the immediate direct benefits on a construction time frame would be fairly significant for the communities. And we saw a variety of numbers as well indicating the overall benefits. I think we have to indicate there's going to be some sort of economic benefit. Workers are going to be employed, they're going to spend money, they need services, housing, recreational, food, gas stations, whatever, they need all of that. So there's certainly be something directly in those communities. I don't know if I'll talk about property taxes and right-of-way at another time, but I feel like the right-of-way is really under public use. And the property tax, there's documents based on the value.
I think that you need to weigh both, sorry, Ms. White, but I think we need to weigh both of the presentations by the economists and make sure that you talk about how they reached and specifically with whether or not what should have been included in that analysis.
I would concur. I mean, at the end of the day, there was probably a differential of 742 million up to a higher number. But what was being counted as a real economic benefit, payment for the voluntary easements was something that was discussed at fairly great length. Is that really a driver, or there would already be money from crops or whatever that land was used for production? And so is it really more of a switching out of one source of income versus another? So do you count that? I think that those are all issues that certainly have to be discussed and then determine the appropriate amount of weighting on those.
Yeah, if I remember, I believe the Dakota Access study showed $1.1 billion in benefit, and the interveners was high 780 something. And, so even without discussion of, okay, even if you do throw out what they think, the right-of-way payments, I had a very lengthy discussion. I think the lengthy discussion you were referring to was mine. So, yeah, even if you throw those out, it showed there is a benefit of 700 million. I think you do have to look at the right-of-way payments coupled with the landowners, and they have to be discussed together because I think that when we talked about potential costs or detriments, obviously that would be one of them. Are those right-of-way payments offsetting enough? Otherwise, it's pretty clear that it's going to create temporary jobs. It's going to create permanent jobs. Some have argued that's not enough permanent jobs. But there's, the testimony is pretty clear there was no argument that it wasn't going to create jobs, both short-term and long-term.
I probably should have asked this, but do either of you have any questions with any of the items that we've talked about to this point?
No, thank you. Right, I think we're following along.
All right. You'd step in, right, if you...
We're not shy.
Yeah. Just verifying.
So as to the discussion that we want to have about whether or not those economic models took into account the right things, you wanted to have that discussion later?
The only, not really, we can have it now. I mean, where I struggle to try and figure out is, I see those analysis, where does it weigh in what the damages are and the loss of the farmland and the cropland and those damages that occur after the fact, during construction and after the fact? How do we weigh that in looking at PCN and those economic figures? Because that obviously is then a negative. So I know it's a weighing, but that's a detriment. Is that a long-term detriment, and should it be applied to those?
Well, that was the two sides of that argument.
Right.
Was one party included right-of-way and damage payments, and as economic in the economic model, and the other one didn't. And the contention was that you were simply swapping ownership, which shouldn't be an economic benefit. And clearly, I think it was clear from the discussion I had. I don't agree with that, because if we can place a restriction, or there is a restriction that they have to pay for damages. So then the question is that only during construction, after construction, for the life of that? And there's a recent court case that made that pretty clear. So I think some of it is dependent on any restrictions that we may want to place on those damage payments and requirements.
What I heard Chair Huser ask is, how do you factor in and what's the length of those damages? Yes, there's an ag mitigation plan, but what if it takes longer to get that land back into full production? How does that economic impact? That to me is different than the payments for the voluntary easements versus, or the easements versus, offsetting whatever that land was used for production or whatever. So to me, that's different. I also think, I'm gonna drag property tax into this, but while yes, there is a benefit, and I think Code Access said $27 million a year in property tax, or a figure like that. As I indicated with the potential economic benefits, there are also going to be more pressure put on some of these communities. You may need more fire and public safety officials, so that budget may increase. If you're trying to deal with several hundred temporary residents of your area, what does that do to your infrastructure, and how is that offset with the property taxes payments, or those expenses that we need to factor in as well? So it seems to me that the numbers change depending on what you factor in and what you don't. And I'm not sure we saw a lot of information on some of the negative effects or the challenges of offsetting some of the benefits that were touted. So I get the point of what do you do about damages, and how long do you factor that in, and that's a column that offsets some of the benefits.
Well, that was, and that's one of the, I believe it was Mr. Mahmood, because one of the concerns that was brought up during the public comment period was that they said they were only gonna pay damages for 3 years. And so I remember asking, I think it was Mr. Mahmood, are you gonna pay damages if they can show that there's damage, or that they're not getting the same growth or whatever out of the area that the pipeline went through? Will you pay that damage more than 3 years? And he said yes. I think, but yes, there is a long-term thing there that you have to take into account and weigh. And yeah, how do you make that? How do you weigh that?
So this may be a bad analogy, but I owe you $1 because you put money into an envelope for me. You know where I'm at. You can come find me and get your $1 back. I have damages that occur on my property, and the person I have to find and the contact people I have to find aren't in the state of Iowa. It's not that easy. It's like, I think that's a weighing factor, or making sure that it's conditioned upon the ability for our landowners to get that. Which reminded me, David, Mr. Wright, we discussed, damages, ag mitigation plan, what happens to that farmland or that property if something after, if a pipeline project of any type were approved, what is that process again for damages after the fact, after the construction? Remember you were saying, or Mr. Lynch, Mr. Wright, I don't.
My understanding is that if, for example, a landowner feels that the crop damages continue after the 3-year period, they, under Iowa Code Section 479B.29, they can give the pipeline company notice at least 2 weeks prior to harvest so that they can get out there and see it for themselves and reopen that question and negotiate on further damages. And if they are not able to reach agreement on that, then the county Board of Supervisors, with the right party, can then step in and make that decision on what those damages should be. Or they can arrange for someone to do that.
And where does the utility board come back into that process?
If the pipeline company at that point were to refuse to pay those damages, then the county Board of Supervisors would come back to the board for enforcement of their decision.
And if we enforce or place a penalty, where does that money go?
If the board collects a civil penalty for that failure, then the money would go to the Iowa Energy Center.
And are the requirements for how a landowner would get notified? So we have that window of harvest time. They notify whom? the number, the contact number that's in the ag mitigation plan?
I believe that's correct.
Thank you for, I just wanted to make sure I was remembering that correctly.
It was $5, by the way.
That was a bit
So
of a joke.
noted.
But I'm not worried about it. So, back to the, do we wanna have the conversation? I'm not saying I wanna have the conversation now, I'm just asking so I can be prepared for what we think were or weren't the right items in the economic models. Is that a discussion we wanna have later, or?
No, I think we have it, I think we do it now. If you're ready for that, you wanna go in?
I believe the biggest contentions were, items that were shown in Mr. Lipsman's model to be purchased in Iowa that couldn't possibly be purchased in Iowa. And then the right-of-way payments. And I don't remember if they lumped right-of-way and damage payments in the same. I know right-of-way payments were not considered in Mr. Immerman's model, as well as the items from Iowa, but I don't recall whether damage payments were or not. And so I would go back to, even if we find that those shouldn't have been added, or those are incorrectly applied, Mr. Immerman's model still shows a benefit of close to $800 million to Iowa. When I look, I mean, like I said, I had a long discussion on the right-of-way payments. It's difficult for me. I understand what he means by a transfer of property, but at the same time of that transfer happens, the landowner retains the ability to use that property and also gets paid for that transfer. So even if you split that, and I think actually when you go back and look at Mr. Lipsman's model, the numbers that he used for right-of-way payments, I believe was in around 30 to 40 million. And the testimony showed that they're actually going to be around 80 million. And that was at the time of hearing. I don't know, maybe that's changed, but that's what we have to go off of. So you could argue that Mr. Lipsman's model actually undervalued it as it was before that even goes into contention.
You're looking at the factors that were put in and those that were argued that shouldn't have been put in, and I'm looking at Mr. Immerman's and saying, okay, throw out all those other factors. If we use that, we still have 787 million. To me, then the next issue is, which of those factors that were included are long-term? Because, so there's your immediate, that's why I pulled property taxes out.
Right.
Because that's a long-term benefit.
Right.
Well, 12 employees is a long-term benefit, but what else is there?
Yeah, and I think even the testimony showed that those are not, that doesn't calculate long-term benefits. That is a set period of dollars that are infused, and then that's a short-term number. So yes, I mean, you gotta look at the long-term and what.
Which then is what makes me go back to, okay, what happens to an abandoned line? Where do they continue to pay property taxes if they abandon it? What happens in the long term? I mean, those other types of things, what happens to the property, landowner, what happens to the actual pipeline, and we haven't really had a chance to talk about some of that. And obviously how it relates then to this petition.
We actually
Yes,
have,
asked about that question.
yeah,
About
we
those
actually
other-
have this liquid pipeline that is, I'm gonna call it dormant right now, right? Not in production.
We're gonna put you on the spot.
My understanding is that, at least with the current technology, the pipeline would be flushed and then filled with nitrogen to prevent interior corrosion, and then held against future use, if another use develops. If it is not used for a certain amount of time, I want to say 5 years, but not positive about that, the landowner can bring an action for reversion of the easement and require that the pipeline company remove the pipe or any pipeline facilities associated with them that are located on his property. But if the pipeline can show it has a reasonable anticipation that it's actively maintaining the pipeline and has a reasonable anticipation of future use, then the pipeline can stay. The reversion won't take place. So there'd be a fact question of that.
Who would make the decision on that reversion?
I'm not sure the statute's clear on that. It's section 479B.32, so it's in the board's area. That could be a question for the board, but it talks more about an action in terms that make me think it could go to court. I'm not aware it's ever been used.
Wouldn't you want to, in any pipeline case, include language so it clearly sets out and gives continuity to the landowner, so they know what happens? I mean, why wouldn't we tell them that?
I'm sorry, I'm not following the question.
Why wouldn't we tell a landowner, if we're going in and putting a pipeline through their property, what options they have? If it's abandoned or if it's left, so that you don't have the, hypothetical case where some farmer's pulling out an entire line.
It is included, the statute is included in the package of information that is given to the landowners at the public information meeting. So they have that information.
I've got that response down.
But I also have a question then, if it's determined that a pipeline is to be removed from a property owner's land, is there a mitigation plan for the land once that trench is redug and the pipe is removed?
I think those would be issues that would have to be addressed if that happened. That the practical reality in most cases is that having been trenched up once, people aren't really excited about having the land trenched up again to remove the pipeline.
And what the statute says is that the same provisions with regard to damages for construction that apply to when the pipeline has to be removed.
So is that in the easement agreement itself, or is that in the ag mitigation plan that it sets that language out?
What's in
I know it's in the
statutory language.
statute, so the more appropriate question is that information in either the easement agreement or in the ag mitigation plan?
I think more likely it's in the damage plan that they file. And so whatever those provisions are would apply if the pipeline is removed.
And by the way, this would probably be another good point, is we know there are a number of different conditions that relate to some of the issues that we're discussing today, and it's fully our intent to take those items up at the next Friday meeting at 1 o'clock. Do you have any further questions?
Yeah, I do. So if statute requires the same damages as when it was as construction, if the easements are in perpetuity, which one wins?
Well, one of the, if the landowner were to bring an action for reversion and, have the pipeline permit revoked, then the easement would terminate.
So even if an easement agreement says that easement is in perpetuity, if they don't have the certificate to operate.
The easement's still subject to the statute.
Okay. So the statute wins.
Yes.
Thanks.
I know we've kind of gone back and forth between 6 and 7. Focusing on 6 of Exhibit F, does anyone have any other comments? Then number 7, which I have not read, is Exhibit F to the petition. Is the project is a $3.78 billion investment, creating nearly 12,000 construction jobs, including an estimated 4,000 in Iowa, generating labor income and state income tax revenue, including more than $27 million in taxes in Iowa. The project will mean more than $1 billion in direct spending for materials, mostly in the United States. It will also provide $195 million in easement payments to landowners, including $60 million in Iowa. We've had conversations about those numbers. Is there any additional questions or comments? Number 8 on Exhibit F to the petition states that the project will result in secondary benefits to the United States, and particularly the region where the pipeline will be located, with multiplied economic impact of nearly $5 billion during the construction phase.
This has been kind of interwoven in several of our comments already. We've talked about whether you count out of Iowa benefits, which to me would be the secondary benefits in the United States. We've talked about the pipeline going to transporting crude oil to Patoka, Illinois, and using Midwestern refineries, which in my mind would be part of the secondary benefit to the U.S., and also then refineries that may be big further like in the Gulf Coast, so there would be those potential benefits. The region where the pipeline would be located with multiple economic impact, a multiplier to $5 billion. I assume that is not just Iowa. I assume, to take it literally, it would be North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, Illinois, if you just went along the route of the pipeline. But it seems to me that we've talked about that, whether that is a heavily weighted item in this conversation about secondary benefits in the United States. To me, that's not a heavy weight, particularly when we're looking at public use or a PCN. It's important to note there will be economic benefits that could be, but I don't think that's talking about secondary benefits would be a big driver in the decision.
Mr. Wagner? It is my intent to take a 10-minute recess and come back in, and at that time I'll give you an outline of the next 4 or 5 issues that the board is going to discuss. We will recess until 2:40 p.m.
At this time, I'll take my student attendance break and then I'll come back up.